The summer of 1965 had a heavy heat in Indianapolis, the kind that made sidewalks shimmer and neighbors sit out on porches long after sunset. In a quiet working-class neighborhood, two teenage sisters, Sylvia and Jenny Likens, were trying to settle into a new life. Their parents, carnival workers who spent months traveling between state fairs, had arranged for the girls to stay with a woman named Gertrude Baniszewski. To them, she seemed kind, motherly, and safe, a trusted figure in a city that felt ordinary and steady. No one imagined that behind the walls of Gertrude's modest two-story home, Sylvia's life would descend into one of the darkest and most horrifying tales of abuse ever recorded in America. Sylvia Marie Likens was 16, a shy but lively girl with long brown hair and a gentle smile. She was polite, thoughtful, and protective of her younger sister Jenny, who had a leg brace from polio. Sylvia was the kind of girl who never complained, always helping others before herself. Her parents, Lester and Betty Likens, loved their children but struggled financially. They made their living selling food and treats at traveling fairs, a business that kept them constantly moving. When they met Gertrude, a mother of 7 who seemed eager to take in boarders for extra cash, it sounded like the perfect arrangement. For $20 a week, the girls would have a home, meals, and supervision while their parents worked on the road. The agreement was sealed with a handshake and a promise. At first, things seemed fine. Gertrude's home at 3850 East New York Street looked like any other. The wooden porch sagged a little, paint chipped on the edges, but it was warm and filled with noise: children playing, music from the radio, neighbors stopping by. Gertrude herself was a thin, frail woman of 37 who looked older than her years. She was worn down by illness, exhaustion, and years of poverty. Still, she had a certain charm, a way of appearing gentle when she wanted to. She smoked constantly, coughed often, and took to her bed for days when her health declined. Sylvia and Jenny tried their best to adjust, doing chores and keeping out of trouble. For a short while, life felt stable, almost normal. But as the days passed, something inside that house began to change. Gertrude's pleasantness faded, replaced by irritability and bursts of anger. When Lester Likens failed to send the boarding money on time one week, her frustration turned toward Sylvia. "You're just like your mother," she'd hiss, calling her names, blaming her for things she didn't do. The insults grew harsher, the punishments crueler. At first, they were small slaps, scoldings, chores doubled, but they soon turned into beatings. The other children in the house began to join in, laughing when Sylvia cried, mocking her for reasons they barely understood. The line between discipline and sadism vanished completely. Sylvia's sister Jenny, fearful and physically weak, tried to protect her but couldn't. Gertrude's own children watched their mother's fury as if it were normal. Soon, neighborhood kids started to come around, invited by the Baniszewski children to witness what they began to treat as entertainment. The abuse turned into a sick form of group participation, a spectacle of cruelty that grew more disturbing with each day. Gertrude had a special hatred for Sylvia. She accused her of lying, of flirting, of being dirty. Much of it stemmed from twisted jealousy and resentment. Sylvia was young, healthy, and kind, everything Gertrude no longer felt she was. When rumors spread that Sylvia had a boyfriend, Gertrude's cruelty intensified. She claimed Sylvia was pregnant, though there was no truth to it. In her warped sense of morality, she believed punishing Sylvia would somehow restore order or teach her a lesson. What followed would become one of the most shocking and senseless acts of prolonged torture in modern American history. It began with small humiliations, forcing Sylvia to stand in the corner, making her eat leftovers, or denying her food altogether. Then, the beatings grew severe. She was struck with belts, paddles, and burned with cigarettes. Each day blurred into the next, filled with pain, hunger, and fear. Sylvia's once bright and lively spirit started to dim, but she tried to protect Jenny from Gertrude's wrath. She never told her parents what was happening, afraid it would only make things worse. Outside that house, life went on as if nothing was wrong. The neighborhood seemed unaware or chose not to see what was happening inside. Kids came and went, some joining in the abuse, others too frightened to tell adults. The cruelty became routine. Gertrude had lost all sense of reality, convincing herself she was teaching Sylvia a moral lesson. But there was no lesson, only hatred, confusion, and suffering. Jenny, terrified and powerless, endured her own share of fear. She watched helplessly as her sister's condition worsened. Sometimes she tried to comfort Sylvia when Gertrude wasn't around, whispering to her that it would all be over soon, that their parents would return and take them away. Sylvia would smile faintly, even through her bruises. "We'll be okay," she'd say, though deep down, she knew the walls of that house had become her prison. As the weeks turned into months, Gertrude's madness deepened. Her teenage daughter Paula, encouraged by her mother, joined in the beatings, often using her fists and whatever object was nearby. Neighborhood boys, including a teenager named Coy Hubbard, were allowed to participate. They used Sylvia like a punching bag, urged on by Gertrude's approval. What might have been fleeting cruelty for them became Sylvia's endless nightmare. Sometimes Gertrude forced Sylvia to repeat degrading statements about herself, breaking her spirit one word at a time. At other times, she would deny her water, force her to sleep on the basement floor, or burn her with cigarettes. The children laughed as it happened, as if it were a game. The cruelty was so constant, so casual, that it began to feel like a ritual, a daily performance of evil hidden behind closed doors. Despite everything, Sylvia tried to hold on to her humanity. She still worried about Jenny, still asked about her parents. She dreamed of running away, of somehow escaping the nightmare. Once, she did try to flee, managing to reach the front porch before being caught and dragged back inside. Gertrude beat her so severely afterward that she could barely move for days. No one intervened. Not the neighbors who saw her bruises, not the teachers who noticed her absence. It was as if Sylvia had vanished into a void of indifference, trapped in a home surrounded by people who either didn't care or didn't want to get involved. The lack of action from adults who could have saved her would later haunt the entire community. Gertrude's home had become a place of constant violence and chaos. Her children had learned cruelty as if it were affection. The lines between victim and aggressor were erased, leaving Sylvia isolated in a house full of enemies. She began to withdraw, her body weakening, her voice growing faint. But even then, she found moments of small strength, tiny acts of defiance that showed her will to survive. She still spoke softly to Jenny, still tried to comfort her when Gertrude wasn't around. Her resilience, even in pain, made her story both heartbreaking and unforgettable. By late October, Sylvia's condition had worsened dramatically. She was severely malnourished, covered in bruises and burns. Her once vibrant eyes were dull, but she still looked toward the door sometimes, hoping anyone would come. The cruelty had become mechanical now. Gertrude and the others inflicted pain not out of emotion, but habit. Sylvia was no longer treated as a person. She was something less than human to them, an object for their anger, a scapegoat for every frustration that boiled inside that crumbling house. Still, no one came. The neighbors ignored the screams. The mailman dropped off letters without question. Children passed by the windows and pretended not to see. The silence outside matched the horror within. It was a tragedy growing in plain sight, and no one stopped it. By the end of October, Sylvia could barely stand. Her body had been pushed past its limits, yet she still whispered reassurances to Jenny, telling her to stay strong, that their parents would come soon. Those final days of hope, faint as they were, made her suffering even more tragic. She was just a teenager, kind, trusting, and undeserving of any of it. What began as a simple arrangement between two families had turned into a descent into pure evil. The house that was supposed to protect her had become her prison. The people who were supposed to care for her had become her tormentors. And outside, the world carried on, unaware that a young girl's cries for help were being swallowed by the walls of an ordinary home on an ordinary street. By late October 1965, Sylvia's world had shrunk to a single room and a few feet of basement floor. The walls that once echoed with children's laughter now held only her cries. The home at 3850 East New York Street had become a private chamber of horror, and the woman who ruled it, Gertrude Baniszewski, had slipped completely beyond sanity. She was a mother who had lost her empathy, a woman consumed by bitterness and control. Each day brought new ways to degrade and destroy the girl she had promised to protect. The line between punishment and pleasure had blurred for Gertrude. What began as anger over missed rent payments had turned into an obsession. She could not stop herself from tormenting Sylvia, she found validation in it. She used the girl as a symbol of everything that made her feel powerless: her failing health, her poverty, her loneliness. It was as if every beating, every cruel word, restored some twisted sense of authority. The others followed her lead, as though cruelty were contagious. Her teenage daughter Paula, who had once been close to Sylvia, became one of her mother's most vicious accomplices. Paula was strong, angry, and jealous of Sylvia's looks, her kindness, her easy way with people. She joined in the abuse without hesitation, hitting Sylvia again and again, laughing when her mother called her names. The acts of violence became ritual. Gertrude used anything within reach: a belt, a broom, a heated spoon, sometimes even her fists. When Sylvia begged for mercy, the older woman would sneer, saying she deserved it. The children, some barely in their teens, watched and learned. The neighborhood boys, Coy Hubbard and John Baniszewski among them, came by regularly. They treated the suffering like a game, each trying to outdo the other in cruelty. To them, Sylvia was no longer human, she was an outlet for their rage, their boredom, their need to feel powerful. Jenny, Sylvia's younger sister, lived in constant fear. Every time she tried to defend Sylvia, Gertrude turned on her too. "Do you want to be next?" she'd shout. Jenny's heart raced every time she heard her sister scream. She knew she couldn't stop it, not without risking her own life. Still, she clung to the faint hope that someone would notice, that a neighbor or teacher would ask questions. But no one did. Fear and silence held the neighborhood in place like invisible chains. The cruelty took on new forms each day. Gertrude forced Sylvia to strip naked and stand in front of the others, shaming her as they left. She made her eat from the trash, drink dirty water, and sleep without blankets. When Sylvia complained of hunger, Gertrude mocked her, saying she didn't deserve to eat. The girl's parents had no idea what was happening. Letters sent by Sylvia were either destroyed or never written at all. She was cut off completely from the outside world. Sometimes, even in her weakened state, Sylvia would whisper to Jenny, asking her to pray. They'd hold hands when no one was looking, trying to remember the life they'd had before the fairs, the laughter, the smell of popcorn and cotton candy. For a moment, it almost felt real again. But the sound of Gertrude's footsteps would always bring the nightmare back. The neighborhood children began to see the abuse as a kind of attraction. Word spread that there was a girl being punished in the Baniszewski house, and some came just to watch. Gertrude didn't stop them. In fact, she encouraged it. "You can help," she'd say coldly, handing them a stick or a belt. It became a dark spectacle, hidden behind ordinary walls. Kids who should have been playing baseball or going to school were now participants in something monstrous. Gertrude's delusions grew worse. She convinced herself Sylvia was evil, that she had corrupted the other children. She told them Sylvia spread lies, that she was promiscuous, that she needed to be taught a lesson. The lies gave them permission to continue. The cruelty wasn't random anymore, it had purpose, justification, a twisted morality that made them feel righteous. Every act of pain they inflicted was, in their eyes, deserved. One night, Gertrude dragged Sylvia to the basement. It was damp, cold, and dark, barely lit by a small bulb. "This is where you'll stay," she told her. Sylvia's body was frail, her face bruised and swollen. She could barely stand. The basement became her cage. She was left without food for days, forced to live on scraps of bread or water when someone remembered. Sometimes Gertrude would lock the door and leave her alone in the dark, her only company the sound of dripping water and the faint echo of laughter upstairs. She was completely forgotten except when it was time to hurt her again. Despite her suffering, Sylvia still tried to hold on to her dignity. She thanked Jenny for bringing her small bits of food when she could. She whispered that she forgave her, that none of it was her fault. Jenny's tears would fall silently in the dark, but Sylvia would squeeze her hand and smile weakly. "We'll go home soon," she'd say. But deep down, both sisters knew that home was a dream slipping further away. Gertrude's cruelty became more creative, more depraved. She began branding Sylvia with a heated needle, carving words into her skin to humiliate her. One afternoon, she forced her teenage son to burn letters into Sylvia's stomach, letters that spelled out a vile phrase, meant to shame her forever. Sylvia cried out in pain, her body shaking, but no one stopped it. Not one of the children, not one of the adults in that house, had the courage to say no. Even the smallest gestures of humanity were punished. When one of the kids hesitated to hurt Sylvia, Gertrude scolded them. "She deserves everything she gets," she'd bark. Fear of defying her kept everyone obedient. It was like a cult, Gertrude's madness infecting everyone around her, making cruelty seem normal. The days blended into one another, filled with beatings, starvation, and silence. Sylvia's body was covered in wounds, her spirit fading. Yet, her eyes still held traces of the girl she'd once been, the hopeful, kind teenager who loved her family and dreamed of a simple life. She still called out for her parents sometimes, in moments of delirium. "Mom! Dad, please," but no one came. Outside, the world continued, indifferent to the horror behind those walls. The street was filled with children riding bicycles, people mowing lawns, neighbors chatting on porches. None of them knew or wanted to know that a 16-year-old girl was dying just a few feet away. It was a chilling reminder of how evil can hide in plain sight, disguised by normalcy. Jenny's fear reached a breaking point. She wanted to tell someone, anyone, but Gertrude's threats were constant. "If you say a word, you'll end up like her," she'd whisper. So Jenny stayed quiet, her silence heavy with guilt and terror. She would later recall how Sylvia still tried to smile, even when she was too weak to move. "She was the strongest person I ever knew," Jenny would say years later. She never gave up, not really. As October turned to November, Sylvia's health deteriorated rapidly. She could no longer walk properly. Her body trembled with every movement, her voice barely audible. Gertrude showed no mercy. In her twisted mind, she believed she had to finish what she started. The other children followed blindly, their empathy long gone. The basement became a place of screams and silence, where cruelty lived unchecked. One night, a neighbor heard strange noises coming from the house. Someone mentioned they'd seen Sylvia looking sick, limping. But no one intervened. Fear of confrontation, or perhaps disbelief, kept them quiet. The police were never called. The suffering continued, uninterrupted. Sylvia's last days were marked by hallucinations and fading consciousness. She drifted in and out of awareness, murmuring to Jenny about their parents, the fairs, and the summer days they used to share. She dreamed of freedom, of sunlight, of escape. Sometimes she'd apologize to Jenny for things that weren't her fault. "I'm sorry, Jen," she whispered once, "for making trouble." Jenny held her hand, crying silently, unable to speak. Gertrude's cruelty reached its final crescendo. She began forcing Sylvia to perform humiliating acts for the amusement of others, laughing as the girl stumbled, too weak to stand. When Sylvia collapsed, Gertrude accused her of faking it and kicked her in the stomach. The blows were brutal. Sylvia gasped for air, her frail body unable to take more. Still, no one stopped it. Not even when her breathing became shallow, not even when her eyes lost their focus. The cruelty had gone on for so long that it no longer shocked anyone in that house. It had become their routine, their shared secret. And in that silence, Sylvia's life was slowly fading away. By the end of the week, it was clear that she couldn't survive much longer. Jenny knew it too. She wanted to scream, to run, to tell someone, but fear held her frozen. She prayed silently that somehow, a miracle would happen, that someone would notice before it was too late. But the miracle never came. The world outside continued to move, unaware that in a small, unremarkable house in Indianapolis, a young girl's light was about to be extinguished forever. The days that followed were a blur of pain and confusion for Sylvia Likens. Her body had become frail and bruised beyond recognition, her spirit trapped between hope and surrender. Down in the cold basement, the faint light bulb flickered, barely casting enough glow to show the outline of her figure. Each shallow breath she took seemed like it might be her last. Her lips were cracked, her skin pale and raw, her eyes distant yet still searching, perhaps for a trace of kindness, a memory of safety, or a sign that this nightmare would finally end. Gertrude Baniszewski's home had turned into a nightmare factory, but she didn't see it that way. In her twisted mind, she was maintaining order, teaching Sylvia a lesson about morality, while her own household rotted in violence and neglect. Her older daughter, Paula, had become crueler than ever. She would slap Sylvia for the smallest thing, mocking her voice, calling her names that no one deserved to hear. Coy Hubbard and the Baniszewski boys still came by, laughing as they struck her, taking turns as if it were sport. What they didn't realize or refuse to see was that Sylvia was dying right in front of them. Jenny, her younger sister, could hardly recognize her anymore. The sister who used to make her laugh, braid her hair, and talk about dreams of working at the fair was now broken and fading. Every night Jenny whispered prayers that someone would find out, that their parents would come home early, that anything would stop this. But no miracle came. The screams, the crying, the bruises all were hidden behind the thin walls of that crumbling house, while outside, the world continued as though nothing had changed. One afternoon, Gertrude decided to make Sylvia confess her supposed sins. She gathered the children in the living room and forced Sylvia upstairs. Barely able to walk, Sylvia was dragged by her arms, trembling. Gertrude shoved a piece of paper in her hand and told her to write a letter. It was to be her confession, saying she had run away and was attacked by a group of boys. "You'll write it," Gertrude said coldly, "so your parents won't think we did anything wrong." Sylvia's hands shook as she held the pencil, the words barely legible. The pain in her body made even holding it a struggle. She wrote as she was told, tears smudging the ink. When she was finished, Gertrude took the note, folded it neatly, and smiled with chilling satisfaction. It was her way of erasing guilt, or so she thought. That evening, Gertrude's rage flared again. Sylvia tried to move, to escape somehow, but her legs gave out. She fell to the floor, whispering weakly that she couldn't stand your faking, Gertrude snapped, before ordering the children to carry her back to the basement. The stairs felt endless. Sylvia's body hit each step, her head striking the wood. Jenny followed behind, tears streaming down her face, knowing she couldn't stop it. When they reached the bottom, Sylvia lay there motionless, barely breathing. "She'll learn," Gertrude muttered, lighting another cigarette. The smoke curled around her as she turned away, leaving Sylvia in the darkness. Hours passed. The basement grew colder. Sylvia's breathing slowed, her voice almost gone. She whispered Jenny's name faintly, and Jenny knelt beside her. "I'm sorry," Sylvia said. "It's okay," Jenny replied, trying to sound brave, her small hand trembling as she wiped Sylvia's face. "You'll be home soon. Just hold on." Sylvia gave a weak smile, one last flicker of the gentle girl she had always been. "Tell Mom and Dad I tried," she whispered. Jenny nodded, though her heart felt like it was breaking in two. That night, Sylvia's strength finally gave out. Her body could no longer endure the starvation, the beatings, the infections. When Gertrude came down the next morning, she found Sylvia lying still on the cold floor. At first, she didn't believe it. She kicked her lightly, shouting her name, but Sylvia didn't respond. For the first time in months, the basement was silent. The reality of what she had done began to sink in, not as guilt, but as panic. Gertrude screamed for her children to come. "She's dead," she shouted. The words echoed through the house. The children gathered around, their faces pale. Some of them started crying, others just stared in shock. Coy Hubbard backed away, shaking his head. "We didn't mean," he stammered, but the words died in his throat. Jenny was frozen, staring at her sister's body, unable to move or speak. The nightmare that had consumed their lives had finally ended, but in the worst possible way. Gertrude moved quickly to cover it up. She ordered the children to clean the basement and dress Sylvia's body. She placed the fake letter beside her, planning to tell police that Sylvia had run away and returned injured. But the story was already falling apart. Jenny, trembling with fear and grief, found her chance. When the police arrived, responding to a panicked call from Gertrude claiming Sylvia had died suddenly, Jenny finally broke her silence. As one officer pulled her aside, she whispered the words that changed everything, "Get me out of here, and I'll tell you everything." The confession poured out of her in sobs. She told them about the beatings, the burns, the starvation, the days locked in the basement. The officers listened in disbelief. They rushed inside, the sight before them freezing them in horror. Sylvia's body lay lifeless on a soiled mattress, her skin marked with bruises, burns, and carvings. It was unlike anything they had ever seen. The room smelled of decay and despair. One detective would later describe it as the most disturbing crime scene of his entire career. Gertrude tried to play innocent. She repeated her story that Sylvia had run away and returned beaten by strangers. But the truth was obvious. The officers looked at the other children, their faces pale and trembling. One by one, they began to talk, their stories matching Jenny's. Within hours, the house of horrors was surrounded by police cars. Gertrude, her children, and several neighborhood youths were arrested. The quiet street was filled with flashing lights, reporters, and neighbors staring in disbelief. News of Sylvia Likens' death spread quickly. Headlines across the country described it as one of the most brutal crimes ever committed against a child. People couldn't comprehend how such horror had gone unnoticed for months, how teachers, neighbors, and friends had missed the signs. The questions turned into outrage, and outrage into sorrow. The entire nation wanted to know, how could something so evil happen in plain sight? The autopsy results were horrifying. Sylvia had suffered massive internal injuries, severe burns, and hundreds of wounds. The official cause of death was brain swelling and internal bleeding caused by repeated blows. She had been starved, dehydrated, and beaten beyond recognition. The doctor performing the examination was said to have wept afterward. Meanwhile, the police interrogations revealed the full extent of Gertrude's influence. Each child told similar stories, how she directed them, encouraged them, convinced them that Sylvia deserved punishment. Paula, her eldest daughter, admitted to beating Sylvia regularly but insisted her mother made her do it. Coy Hubbard confessed to using his fists and other objects, tears streaming down his face as he realized what he had become a part of. The Baniszewski boys hung their heads, silent and broken. Jenny was placed in protective custody. For the first time in months, she slept in a real bed, ate real food, and was surrounded by adults who wanted to help. But the trauma ran deep. Every sound, every memory of that house haunted her. "I can still hear her screaming," she later said. "I'll never forget it." Gertrude was charged with first-degree murder, along with Paula, Coy Hubbard, and John Baniszewski. The trial that followed captivated the nation. People packed the courtroom, desperate to understand how ordinary people could commit such extraordinary evil. The details that emerged were unbearable. Witnesses described the beatings, the cigarette burns, the branding, the starvation. The defense tried to argue insanity, saying Gertrude was mentally ill and overwhelmed. But the prosecution painted her as a calculating, sadistic woman who had orchestrated the prolonged torture of a defenseless girl. The trial lasted weeks, filled with emotional testimony. Jenny testified, her voice trembling as she described what she and Sylvia endured. At one point, she broke down in tears, forcing the court to pause. The jurors were visibly shaken. Reporters wrote that several people left the courtroom crying. Sylvia's parents, Lester and Betty Likens, sat silently, unable to speak, their faces hollow with grief. They had trusted Gertrude with their daughters' lives, and that trust had ended in unimaginable tragedy. When the verdict finally came, it was a mixture of relief and disbelief. Gertrude Baniszewski was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Paula was convicted of second-degree murder, while Coy Hubbard and John Baniszewski received lesser sentences for manslaughter. Many believed the punishments were too light, that no sentence could truly account for what Sylvia had suffered. But justice, however imperfect, had been served. As Gertrude was led away in handcuffs, she showed no emotion. No remorse, no apology. Even in prison, she insisted she had done nothing wrong, that the children exaggerated, that Sylvia's death was an accident. It was as though she couldn't or wouldn't accept the reality of her cruelty. For Sylvia's family, there was no closure, only loss. Jenny grew up haunted by the memory of her sister's suffering, but she also carried Sylvia's strength with her. She spent years speaking about the case, ensuring people remembered what had happened so that no other child would endure the same fate. Sylvia Likens became a symbol of innocence destroyed, of systemic failure, of how silence can enable evil. Her story forced a nation to confront uncomfortable truths about child abuse, responsibility, and moral blindness. Laws changed, awareness grew, but the scars of her tragedy remained etched in history. The trial that followed the discovery of Sylvia Likens' body was unlike anything Indiana had ever seen. The community that had once turned away from the strange, decaying smell and muffled cries coming from 3850 East New York Street now found itself face to face with the truth. The newspapers printed her name in bold letters: tortured teen found dead in Indianapolis basement. Reporters crowded the courthouse, sketching faces, jotting every word that leaked from the lips of the accused. For the first time, the dark secrets of that small home were spoken aloud for everyone to hear. Gertrude Baniszewski, pale and trembling, sat at the defense table, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She looked like an exhausted mother, frail, worried, almost harmless. But the words that came out during testimony tore through that illusion like lightning splitting a tree. Prosecutors described weeks of escalating violence, humiliation, starvation, and cruelty. They showed photographs of Sylvia's battered body. The courtroom gasped, some people wept. Even hardened detectives who'd worked the case turned their eyes away when the medical examiner described the burns, the wounds, the final moments of her life. Jenny Likens took the stand first. Her small voice trembled as she faced the woman who had terrorized them both. Jenny explained how her parents had left her and Sylvia in Gertrude's care so they could work with the carnival, hoping the girls would be safe in a stable home. She described how, at first, things had seemed normal, how Gertrude had been friendly, offering food and warmth. Then, slowly, things changed. She told the court how Gertrude began calling Sylvia names, accusing her of being promiscuous, of spreading lies, of being dirty. The insults turned into slaps, and the slaps into beatings. The courtroom sat frozen as Jenny explained that she had been forced to watch her sister being beaten and couldn't save her. When the prosecutor asked why she hadn't told anyone, Jenny cried and said, "Because she told me they'd kill me if I did." Every word seemed to echo off the walls, and no one could bring themselves to look at Gertrude. Next came the children, Gertrude's own kids, who had been raised in that twisted house of violence. Paula, the oldest daughter, pregnant at the time, admitted she had hit Sylvia. She said her mother told her to. At one point, she whispered, "I guess I wanted to make her proud." There was something chilling in her tone, something detached, as though the cruelty had become routine, something she could no longer separate from obedience. Stephanie, one of the younger daughters, wept uncontrollably as she described hearing Sylvia beg for help. She claimed she was afraid of her mother, afraid of what would happen if she tried to stop it. The jury listened in silence, their expressions hard, a mix of disbelief and horror. Then the neighborhood boys who had participated in Sylvia's torture took the stand. Ricky Hobbs, Coy Hubbard, John, and James Baniszewski, each of them gave conflicting stories, trying to shift blame, minimize their roles. Some said they thought it was just punishment. Others claimed Gertrude told them Sylvia was a liar who deserved it. But as the details spilled out, the branding with a heated needle, the forced writing carved into her stomach, the endless days locked away, the entire courtroom was sickened. These were children, and yet the cruelty they described was beyond imagination. Gertrude's defense attorney tried to portray her as mentally unstable, suffering from illness, overwhelmed by too many children and not enough money. They said she had lost control, that the situation spiraled, that she didn't fully understand what was happening. But the prosecution had one word that shattered that excuse: deliberate. Every beating, every humiliation, every wound planned, executed, repeated. They painted her as the ringleader, manipulating everyone around her, even the neighborhood kids, into turning against one innocent girl. The jury deliberated for days. When they returned, the verdict was read aloud: Gertrude Baniszewski guilty of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison. Paula received a lesser charge of second-degree murder and was given a sentence of 15 to 30 years. The boys received lighter sentences for manslaughter and were sent to reform schools. For many in Indianapolis, justice felt hollow. No sentence could truly account for what had been done to Sylvia. The idea that ordinary people, neighbors, classmates, even children could participate in something so monstrous haunted everyone who read about it. Teachers, priests, and social workers wondered how so many warning signs had been missed. Sylvia had been crying out in subtle ways, her bruises visible, her fear evident, yet no one had acted in time. Inside prison, Gertrude was not the monster many expected her to be. Inmates described her as quiet, polite, almost grandmotherly. Over time, she earned privileges, worked in the sewing room, even gained the nickname Mom from younger prisoners who never knew her past. But behind that gentle mask, her crimes remained untouched by remorse. She rarely spoke Sylvia's name. When she did, she called the case a mistake, as though it were something small, something that simply got out of hand. In 1985, after serving 20 years, Gertrude Baniszewski was released on parole. The decision sparked outrage across Indiana. Crowds gathered outside the prison, holding signs that read "Justice for Sylvia." Protesters shouted as Gertrude walked free, now an older woman with gray hair and tired eyes. Reporters chased her for statements, but she refused interviews, disappearing under a new name into obscurity. She died in 1990, reportedly of lung cancer, taking her secrets with her. Jenny Likens, Sylvia's younger sister, carried the weight of guilt for the rest of her life. She tried to build a quiet existence, moving away from Indiana, avoiding questions about her past. But whenever someone mentioned the case, her voice would shake. She once said in an interview, "They killed my sister, but they also killed something inside me." Despite that pain, she found strength in making sure Sylvia was never forgotten. She attended memorial services and spoke out about child abuse awareness until her death in 2004. Sylvia's parents, Lester and Betty Likens, were devastated. They never recovered from losing her. Lester lived quietly, often avoiding the press. Betty struggled with alcoholism and died just a few years after the trial. The family, once just trying to make ends meet, was forever broken by their decision to trust a woman they barely knew. In 2001, decades after the murder, a memorial was dedicated to Sylvia Likens in Willard Park, Indianapolis, not far from where the Baniszewski home once stood. The house itself had been demolished in 2009. All that remained was an empty lot, quiet, with grass growing where screams once echoed. At the memorial unveiling, hundreds gathered: neighbors, survivors, activists, even police officers who had worked the case. Jenny's relatives spoke, reading a statement in her memory: "Sylvia's death will not be in vain. Her story will remind us that silence can be as cruel as violence." The plaque reads, "This memorial is in memory of a young girl who lost her life by child abuse. May we all remember her suffering, and may she rest in peace forever." The story of Sylvia Likens continues to haunt true crime history, not only because of its brutality, but because of how ordinary it began. It wasn't a stranger lurking in the shadows, or a serial killer stalking a city. It was a house filled with children, a woman trusted by the community, and neighbors who looked away. It exposed the dark potential of neglect, the way evil can thrive quietly when no one dares to intervene. In documentaries and books, Sylvia's photo appears again and again, a smiling teenage girl with soft curls and bright eyes. It's hard to believe that behind that innocent face was a story so monstrous, so senseless. She wanted to be loved, to fit in, to be cared for. Instead, she became a symbol, a reminder of what happens when compassion fails, when the vulnerable are left unheard. Even decades later, people who learn about her for the first time often say they can't stop thinking about her. The case lingers because it forces us to ask the hardest question: how did this happen in a normal neighborhood, surrounded by people who could have saved her? Sylvia's name now stands beside the countless victims of child abuse whose suffering changed laws and awareness forever. Her story inspired reforms in child welfare systems, mandatory reporting policies, and neighborhood watch programs. Teachers were trained to notice warning signs. Social workers were reminded that sometimes the smallest bruise can tell the loudest story. Though her life was short, Sylvia Likens became the reason many children were later rescued from similar horrors. The legacy of her suffering is the saving of others. And in that sense, her story, as tragic as it was, gave something powerful to the world: a call to conscience, a cry that still echoes: do not look away.